So here we are for the very final speaker of the day, and I am kind of giddy. So Lee is glamorous because he's not from here. He's come all the way from Seattle. He's crossed an international border to see you today. That's how much he loves you. You probably are familiar with Lee's work. He'll give you some reminders soon. So I'm not going to tell you about those projects because when you see them, you're like, oh my God, I totally know that video. But Lee is an explainer, and he's basically the explainer to the point where he actually wrote the book on it. Yes, and I know everyone says like, yeah, they wrote the book on it. In his case, literally wrote the book on it. It's called The Art of Explanation, and it's really something you've got to put into your reading queue because it is really useful in just helping you talk to the world. So he has created explanations for some of the world's most respected brands, and basically millions of people, and I'm not lying there, millions of people have seen his work and sort of had their eyes opened like, oh, that complicated thing I now get. RSS, I don't understand it either. Lee can make that happen. So his goal is to make the world a little bit more understandable, and he's going to share some of that magic with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Lee Lefever. Thank you for coming out.
Thanks, Eli. It's great to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So raise your hand if you explained something like in the last week. Probably most people, right? So how many of you, keep your hands up, how many of you actually planned it or thought about how you were going to do it before you did it? Wow, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. I think that that's what we're going to talk about today is actually thinking about and being intentional about how we explain ideas, whether it's in a situation like this or in a meeting or talking to your family or whatever it is. I want to help you think differently about explanation and hopefully be a better explainer. So I'm going to start with a little bit about how I got here and sort of what led me to this sort of subject. I had an epiphany. It was like the light just sort of came on one day. It was about 2004, and I just started Common Craft as a consulting company. And I was at a conference in Silicon Valley, and a group about this size, and there was a CEO speaking. It was a tech CEO, and he mentioned RSS. And this was 2004, so this is 10 years ago. RSS was still kind of a new idea. It was along the time when wikis and blogs and social networking were first starting to be available. And I was really excited about it. I had been an online community manager up to that point, and I really wanted people to really adopt these things. Like they were new and interesting and great, but people really weren't adopting them at the time. And the CEO said these words that I'll never forget. Someone asked, "What is RSS?" And he said, "It's an XML-based content syndication format." So if you look at that answer, it's accurate, it's succinct. It probably sounded great to him, but it didn't help anybody in the room. And we talked about it afterward. What how unhelpful it was. But it didn't help anybody in the room. But that was the point where I had an epiphany because I started to see that RSS was part of this family of social media tools that were going to be a big deal, and one of the things that maybe was keeping people from adopting them maybe wasn't the normal things. It wasn't maybe price or design or engineering or marketing. That maybe it was just explanation. It was just nobody was understanding what they were because the people talking about them were not using a language that normal people could understand. And I thought maybe we could do something about that. Maybe there's a way that we could create explanations that actually help people adopt these things. And that's sort of what's driven us since then, is to create media and do things that helped everyday people see why RSS could actually make a difference in their life, or a blog, or whatever it is. So that's kind of how I got to doing that. And that experience of the RSS kind of thing really outlined this idea of what I call an explanation problem. And that's when the language and the communication style that we use actually inhibits us and keeps our message from actually making a difference to people. And it happens like this. We have this amazing idea. We have people that we want to reach. But what happens is when that idea goes through the sort of language funnel and comes out the other side, it doesn't help the people that we want it to help. And that's, to me, an exclamation problem when our language becomes an impediment or the way that we communicate becomes an impediment. And I started thinking, I got really interested in why this is the case. Like, what's happening? Why is it so natural for us to kind of have this mismatch in how we communicate? And I read a book called Made to Stick a while back. And it's a book I really highly recommend by Chip and Dan Heath. In that book, they talk about this idea called the curse of knowledge. The basic idea of the curse of knowledge is that the more you understand about something, the harder it is to imagine what it's like not to know, like not to understand. And they made the point by showing a study by a woman named Elizabeth Newton at Stanford in 1990. She did a really simple study. She divided folks into two groups. There were tappers and there were listeners. And the job of the tapper was to use their finger on a table and tap out a very common tune like Yankee Doodle Dandy or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And the job of the listener, as you probably guessed, is to listen to that and guess what song they were tapping. So that's the setup. So what she did was did a test with 120 songs. Before the test started, she went to the tappers and said, "What do you think your success rate will be? What percent of the songs that you tap will be successfully guessed?" What do you guys have a guess of what people would guess their success rate would be? Yeah, so it was 50% was what they guessed. So then they did the study, 120 songs, and then the data came back. What do you think the actual rate was? Yeah, it's close. It was 2.5%. So 3 songs out of 120 songs were guessed. So this is the curse of knowledge, that once you have a song playing in your head, it's hard to imagine what it's like not to know, not to hear that song. And when we work in the same world, in the same office, in the same subject matter, that song plays all the time. And then when we turn around and have to talk to somebody that's not hearing that song, we think it's happening. I really love this quote by George Bernard Shaw that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I think that's what's happening. That was what was happening at the conference, was to the person who was speaking, it was communication, but to everybody else, it was an illusion because they had no idea what was really happening. So this is, again, one of the big problems that I see is the curse of knowledge, I think, infects us all. I have it, you have it, everybody has it. And I think that a way out of that is thinking differently about how we explain ideas. Of course, for a group like this, technology, you know that working in technology is filled with these kinds of problems. Every day there's new things that come up that need explanations. There's a lot of challenges in getting people just to simply understand the basics of an idea. And again, I think learning to explain ideas is a way that we can counteract that evolution. So let's talk a little bit about what an explanation is. I'm sure that you know what an explanation is. You can easily look it up. But having thought about it for a really long time, I have a little bit of a unique perspective on it. From my perspective, I think that explanations really oftentimes can be boiled down to answer to a single question. And that question is why? And that's in the form of, why should I care about this? Why does this matter? Why did this happen the way it did? Because answering the question why helps us make sense of things. And it differentiates explanation from other things, because if we can answer the question why successfully, then people might care about what we're talking about. And to me, that's the real barrier. If you can get people to care, they're going to be motivated to find out the details and learn other things. But the caring part's the hard part. And I think answering this question why is what really helps us do the big thing, which is increase understanding. That's what explanations do. They increase understanding. They make things clear, easy to understand. And as you've probably seen, the need for this kind of thing is growing. Bitcoin is a great example. It's a big news story, hugely complicated idea that needs explanation. I saw that Net2Van is hosting an event next week about Bitcoin. So I think that's another indication of how much there is a need for this. These are examples of headlines in the media where media companies are now adopting this idea of explainers. And there's actually something called explainer journalism, which is making waves that you'll probably be hearing more about. There's a new website called Vox.com that is run by journalist, one's Ezra Klein. If you follow politics, you probably know him. But their idea is to understand the news, like news explained in 2 minutes. And they focus on building backstory and context so that the news doesn't seem to appear on a day-to-day basis. They look at the sort of big picture. So this idea of explainers and explainer journalism, again, like I said, is something that I think is growing. So you might be wondering like how a person like me gets to be interested and involved in something like explanation. So a little bit about my path, a little bit more about my path getting here. I mentioned the story about learning about RSS. That started me on a path of writing blog posts that were trying to explain technology. And then in 2006, my wife, Sachi, this is, well, a cartoon version, a Common Craft style version of Sachi, we started thinking about how we could use these explanations in different ways, and YouTube started to be popular. So we started thinking about maybe we could make videos and put them on YouTube, and that would be a way for us to teach people about and explain technologies. And our first video was called RSS in Plain English. And it kind of came from that idea a couple of years before of seeing this explanation problem. And it was actually Sachi's idea to use our format, which we'll see in a second. And that video was a viral hit at the time in the early days of YouTube and was sort of the first explainer video. And we kept making them from then on. And that was when we got hired for companies to make videos. And now we run a subscription service for educators to use videos in the classroom. And I wrote the book. And I'm a really big believer that this idea of explanation has been neglected, and there's a lot of meat here that we can really get into, not just in the talk today, but over the subject in general. But I really do think that we need more explainers, and that's what I hope that you'll feel coming from the talk today. So I want to show you a Common Craft video. This is very serious, and it could really one day save your life. So I really hope you'll pay attention. This is it. We need sound.
These days, you have to watch your back. Danger may be lurking where you least expect it. You may find a relative, friend, or neighbor coming after one thing: your brain. This Halloween is forecasted to be a high season for zombie attacks, and we're going to help you get through it, brain intact. The first step is identifying a zombie. Let's take your Uncle Dan. Here's Dan as we all know him, a normal guy. Now, let's look at Dan as a zombie. Notice the unnatural mouth position and dark eyes. The shoulders will be off-kilter, arms reaching, grabbing, legs limpy, skin pale. This is a zombie. Be careful this Halloween. You may see people that resemble zombies. Remember, zombies don't eat candy, only brains. When you encounter a real zombie, it's time to have a plan. Here's how to survive an attack. Your first reaction may be to retreat to a home or business. This is only a short-term solution because they will never stop, ever. Instead, consider heading to a Costco. Don't plan to wait out an attack without proper rations. Now, keep your cool. Remember that zombies may move quickly in the early stages of infection. Don't underestimate their speed. Also, consider a retreat to high altitudes. Studies have shown that zombies react poorly to cold weather, causing them to become brittle and slow. Lastly, zombies can't swim, so retreat via boat could help. Come back. And remember those rations. If you're not the retreating type, the obvious next move is counterattack. This brings us to our last step: how to kill the undead. The simple idea is kill the brain, stop the zombie. This is generally done through head trauma or decapitation, but any method that removes the zombie brain's ability to direct the undead body will work. As starting points, we suggest large caliber bullets to the head or decapitation via machete, axe, or chainsaw. Now, chainsaws are advanced tools that should be used carefully. Napalm or grenades can also be effective, but be careful. A flaming zombie can be even more dangerous than a normal one. If your friend has a zombie bite, unfortunately, there is only one outcome. Infection is absolutely irreversible. Don't bother with antiseptic or band-aids. Your friend is not your friend anymore. Face the inevitable and save your brain. Kill them with dignity before they become undead too.
Obviously, sort of a joke. We made that for Halloween a few years back, but that's in Common Craft style. The videos that we make now are a little more sophisticated, but still the same kind of style. So the talk today is really based on what we learned from making a lot of these videos. We have a bunch in our library, and we've thought a lot about it. And we're going to kind of go into a version of a journey here where we learn more about explanation and what it takes to make something a little bit more understandable. We'll talk about forces first. These are the things that are sort of always pushing against us and keeping us from explaining things clearly. Talk about some of the pillars of communication, some of the things that are essential in just communication in general, but also in explanation. And then a path to understanding. This sort of goes from a high level to sort of more granular, more specific kinds of steps. So the forces, these are things we all feel, things that I've heard a lot when I talk about explanation, saying like, this is the thing that I think about that keeps me from wanting to do this. I think one of them is, it's not a force in the way that other ones are, but it's we never consider improvement. I say that it's like how we brush our teeth or use a computer. We do it so often. We explain ideas so often that we rarely take a step back and think, like, how am I doing this and could I improve? So that's one of the forces. The second one is a very real worry about condescension. I think a lot of us, when we think about explaining ideas, we think about making it simple or making it basic. And the last thing we want to do is be condescending, because we know how it feels to be condescended to, and it's a horrible feeling. And that's a real risk. But I think that you can think a little bit differently about how to avoid that in explanation, because there's sort of a well-known idea about explanation that it's all about dumbing something down or making it simple or just explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. And I think the problem with that is if you actually explain something like someone's 5 years old, you sound condescending. Like, you can't really do that. But explanation is not really about being as basic as you can be or as simple as you can be. It's about recognizing who your audience is and understanding what the circumstance is and using familiar language. It's not about basic or simple, it's about familiar. And treating people like they're smart, not that you're talking to a 5-year-old. The quote up here is from a science writer named Steven Pinker, that some of you may know. An editor told him one time, he said it was the best writing advice he'd ever gotten, was to treat people as though they were as smart as you, but just not as informed. And I think that's the idea of explanation, is not to treat people like they're dumb, but treat people like they're smart, but just inform smart people and not just try to make it like a 5-year-old. Another thing that I think is really real that I'm sure that a lot of people can identify with is this idea of defensibility. And what I mean by that is that I think that if you came through academia, even in the professional world, you spent a lot of your young life talking to people who knew more than you. So you worked really hard and trained yourself to present ideas in the most defensible way possible. You had to cover every base, make sure you knew every detail, because the last thing you wanted to happen was for your manager or your faculty advisor or someone to poke holes in your idea and say, oh, you forgot about this. So you cover everything. And the thing that made a difference at the time was for you to show how smart you were by how detail-oriented you were and how much data you had. And that's great in that situation. But what happens when you turn from talking to someone who knows more than you to actually helping someone understand something, the same thing doesn't work. You have to switch roles into a role that has to let go of some of that technical accuracy that works on one side and focus on understanding. And those are two different things. And the way that I think about that is on one side, you're covering your ass with data. That's what the data is doing, is covering your ass to make sure that no one's going to poke holes in your ideas. On the other side is focusing on understanding, and those things don't always live in the same world. Sometimes we have to give up a little bit of technical accuracy in order to be more understandable. And for people that come from the scientific world, engineering, that's really, really hard to let go of, like the little exceptions that make what they're trying to say not quite accurate. Right? And I think that if you focus on understanding, you have to be able to let that go and realize that the people you're talking to are not going to know enough to poke holes. They're not going to ask those hard questions. The goal is just understanding. Another quote here that I like is from Sigmund Freud. Analogies, it is true, decide nothing, but they can make one feel more at home. Right? So I think that connects to the same idea that it's hard to use an analogy that is technically accurate, that actually portrays the facts in the way that maybe an engineer would want to do it. But it's not about that. It's about making people feel more at home with ideas. And I think that's why analogies work, is they're not worried about the technical accuracy, they're worried about the idea. So these are the forces. We don't consider improvement. We worry about condescension, which is something we can think of as not dumbing something down, but making it appropriate for our audience and using language that works. And focus on defensibility and realize that the people that need the understanding are not going to know enough to worry about the details, so you can just focus on the big picture. So the second thing is, second part of our journey here is really, I think, general good communication. I think it certainly relates to explanation, but these are just some things that I think you should consider when you're going into a situation where you need to explain something. This is audience, empathy, and language. Audience came up in some of the talks before mine. It's obviously a very important thing to think about. To whom am I speaking? What do they know? What language is going to work for them? What are their needs? And what does success look like? And what's the goal? I think if you go into a situation without this, then it's going to really be hard for you to help people care about what you have to say. I want to show, this will start this sort of another part of our audio video portion here about empathy. I like this little clip from RSA Shorts that kind of explains empathy a little bit. So I'll play this. Hopefully the audio, I think we're good.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people.
A definition of empathy, because I think we hear about empathy all the time, but we don't really think about what it really truly means. So these are the 4 qualities that Dr. Brown said there. Was perspective taking, staying out of judgment, recognizing emotion in others, and communicating that recognition. But I think this idea of perspective taking is really the most powerful part of it in terms of explanation. The example I like to use here is driving directions. I think to the extent we actually do that anymore, now that we use online maps or mobile maps, I think giving driving directions is a really empathetic thing to do, because what makes driving directions work is not necessarily how well you know how to get from point A to point B. Driving directions work best when you're able to forget the way you've done it 1,000 times and imagine what it's like to do it the first time. And that's how you give great directions, because you can see it the way the person that's doing it the first time does. And I think it's the same with explanation, that you have to be able to kind of remove yourself from the situation and imagine what it's like from that person's perspective who's learning, and that gives you a way to think about what your words sound like to them. It's huge in politics. I don't know if you guys see this, but Bill Clinton is often called the explainer-in-chief, and his communication style is very empathetic. He is the guy who's known for this phrase. Whoops. Sorry, I should have let you know that was coming. That was my fault. All right, you ready?
I feel your pain.
Okay, so the last pillar here is language, right? This is probably pretty common sense in a talk about explanation. But I want to go back to the idea about simplicity and using basic language. I don't think that's the case, because imagine if I was a PhD and you were PhDs in physics, I could be explaining something very clearly to you that would sound ridiculous to most people in the world. And that's because explanation is circumstantial, and it's not about basic language, it's about familiar language. Familiarity is really what you're going for in explanation, because that's what makes things interesting and actually respects people's intelligence, is when language is familiar and not beneath them in some ways, because because you're going for a different goal than familiarity. So again, that's sort of the big picture of the pillars is audience. Think about your audience. Try to empathize. Imagine what it's like to sit in those seats or be across from you and hear what your words sound like in language that's familiar, that sounds right to them. So that's the journey. The third part of the journey is the path. So now we're going to get into a little bit more specifics, what I call the sort of stepping stones to explanation, or explanation strategies. So I'll introduce you to this, what we call the explanation scale. This is something that's really just a really simple way of talking through how you might go about explaining something, taking something complex and make it easy to understand. So let me take a break here just for a second. So the idea of the scale, let me back up, is that it's a scale from A, I have to be careful, A to Z, I want to say Z, A to Z, and on the left side represents the less understanding side, and the right side is the more understanding side. And the idea with the explanation scale is to create a strategy for moving someone down the scale, thinking about where they are on the scale now and where you want them to be. So an example might be, let's say that you work in an organization and the leadership has gone on a retreat and come back and said, we're changing things in a major way. We need you to explain it to everybody in the organization. So having learned a little bit about explanation, you get your team together and use a whiteboard maybe and just draw a line and put an A on one side and a Z on the other. And you can start thinking about, well, for this change, where do we think the employees are now? So you might say, they're not, this is not completely foreign to them, so maybe they're at about G. And then how much do we need to explain? Do they need to know every detail? Do they need complete understanding? Probably not. Maybe we need to get them to V, right? So then that allows us to start to think about, well, what happens in that frame? So you can kind of think about the scale in a number of ways. This is just a kind of rule of thumb sort of curve. And what it represents is that explanations are often a balance of why and how. Like, why should I care about it and how do I do it? And for people who end up on the A side of the scale, the proportion that's likely to be most helpful is a lot more why than how, because they need to care about it before they're actually going to do it. Where if someone is more on the Z side, then maybe Z side, sorry, is on the Z side, then they might benefit from a little bit less why and more how, because you're assuming by putting them there that they already understand why it matters. Another way to think about it is oftentimes these ideas move from big ideas to details. So this might help you build a framework. Again, the scale is not a sophisticated model. It's really just a way to discuss how you might approach the situation. So you might say that we could start with big ideas that focus on why, and then move to details that focus on how, right? So then the question becomes, how do you do that? What does it look like to actually create an explanation that actually gets people down the scale? We'll start with what I like to call context and agreement. So this is starting an explanation with building sort of consensus in the room that this is something that matters to you. We can all agree that it's been a hot summer, or we can all agree it rained like crazy yesterday, or whatever it is that gets heads nodding, get people engaged, help them feel confident that you're going to speak in a language that they understand or that matters to them. And this other part of it is, these are things sort of in the beginning of an explanation, that once we've sort of come to agreement, this is what we're going to talk about, then I think we can really focus on this idea of building context. I think that this is one of the things that makes a lot of explanations fail and is really super important, is to build context. And the way that I think about that is to talk about the forest first and then talk about the trees. Because when we have the curse of knowledge, the trees are the things that we think are really the most interesting. And we're assuming, oh, everybody gets the forest. They know that. We don't need to talk about, that's a waste of time to talk about the forest. I'm just going to talk about the trees. And what happens is, people think the trees are the only thing. They don't even see the big picture. But if you're able to put them together, then it becomes something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So I really encourage you in explanations to really, in the beginning, create some context and backstory. Like, tell people the world around your ideas and not just your ideas. So I want to show you an example. This guy is called Jam Handy. He's like the godfather of explainer videos, according to me. He in like the 1930s was hired by a lot of major companies to make videos that are essentially explainer videos. So I'll show you one that explains the differential gear. And if those of you that don't know, if you've ever seen one of these under a truck or a car, you're about to learn more about it. But it explains the differential gear because GM wanted people to know. It was a new engineering thing that happened. So we'll play this video, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
When the troop goes around the corner, the riders on the outside of the turn have to adjust their speed to keep even with the riders on the inside. The man on the outside has to ride a lot farther and a lot faster in order to keep up with the parade. The outside wheels must spin faster than the wheels on the inside because they have a greater distance to travel in the same length of time. When a wagon turns a corner, the wheels can travel at different speeds because each one can turn freely on the axles. And in the early automobiles, the rear wheels turned separately and only one wheel was connected to the engine. But when only one wheel was driven by the engine, it had to do all the work, and it couldn't get a good enough grip on the road to do its job properly. So the one-wheel drive was soon out of date. But if two wheels are locked on an axle so that they are not free to turn separately, one or the other has to slide. So engineers had to find a way to connect both rear wheels to the engine without sliding and slipping on turns. The device which makes this possible is a part of the rear axle. It is called the differential because it can drive the rear wheels at different speeds. The differential looks complicated, but once we understand its principle, it is amazingly simple.
I love the just 1930s-ness of that, like the differential. But he goes on, if you look it up, just Jam Handy differential gear, it's public domain video. But he goes on to build sort of a tinker set with increasingly complex versions of how a differential gear works. It's an amazing explanation, but I think that it's also an interesting point about context. Does anybody catch anything that's sort of connected to context about that video? Does anybody that make any connections with anybody? What's that? Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. Is that he spent almost that whole first part before ever talking about the gear. It wasn't about the gear. It was all about why does it make sense that this was needed? Why should I care that this even exists in the world? And I think that was the forest, right? And then he gets into the trees later, which I won't show, but it goes on for a little while. But I think this is just a great example of not going directly into the trees, but talking about the forest first. So when it's time for you to explain an idea, ask yourself, am I talking about the forest or the trees? And are you sure that the audience understands the forest? Do they know the big picture? Because the trees are going to matter so much more if they do. So the second part of the path here is story. Storytelling is huge. I'm sure a lot of you guys know a lot about storytelling, and I think it's hugely powerful. A lot of our videos are stories in a way that we'll talk about in just a second. But I think this story is interesting because a lot of the stories that we grew up with, that we know, the famous stories, are professionally made. I think storytelling is an art form in a lot of ways. And when it comes time for someone in the business world, if your manager says, okay, now it's your turn to tell a story, it can be intimidating. And I think that while a lot of the stories we're aware of are amazing and useful, that storytelling can be different. It doesn't have to be, a huge story arc with a hero on a hero's journey saving a damsel in distress. An example is Ernest Hemingway. And just a disclaimer, in my research, I've found that this might not be a true story, but it makes for a great point. So that apparently he made a bet that he could tell a story in 6 words, a $10 bet. And he won the bet with this story. Some of you may know it, and I apologize if it's sort of a downer. The story is, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Right? It's super sad. But I mean, it really, it's known as the shortest story ever told. So that's an example of a story being different than something that you imagine. I think a lot of the way that we think about stories in our videos are only 2 or 3 minutes long. We don't have time for a lot of storytelling. So they honestly, if you look at them, not the zombie video necessarily, but they all go through the same kind of progression, and it's like this. Like, meet Bob. He's like you. Bob has a problem. He feels bad. Bob found a solution. He feels great. Don't you want to feel like Bob? And that's the version of storytelling that we do. We don't need to know about Bob's relationship with his mother or anything else that a lot of stories have. The story does a couple of other things. I think story gives the audience a way to really empathize and to hopefully see themselves in the subject matter. It makes ideas more concrete. And they also take these ideas that sort of exist in the ether. This happens a lot in technology, where we talk about a lot of technologies in a way that is not really grounded. But once you tell it in a story and involve a person who learns something new, then suddenly these sort of ideas that live in the ether suddenly become part of a person's reality, and you can kind of see yourself learning about those stories too. So that's another powerful part of story in explanation. So our second stepping stone is story. So you can ask yourself, when it's time for you to explain something, if you simply include a person's experience in what you're explaining, would it help it be more understandable? Right? Because it makes it concrete. Just say, hey, if you're not getting this, then let's talk about a person who actually learned about it. And sometimes that just flips a switch for your audience. Okay, the third thing is connections. This is like connecting one idea to another. Oftentimes, we find the best way for someone to understand something is say, okay, if you understand this thing over here, then think about this new thing like that with a little difference that we'll talk about. So that's the idea of connection. There's a great story from Hollywood about the producers of the movie Alien with Sigourney Weaver. I'm sure you guys have seen it. The producers were having a hard time selling the script in Hollywood, going to different studios. And they realized that just a few years before then, a huge movie had come out that actually gave them a way to sell their script in a whole new way. And that movie was Jaws, right? They saw that actually their movie was kind of like Jaws. Maybe they could make this connection between Jaws and their movie. So the story goes, and this I think is true, that they started pitching the idea of Alien with 3 words. Jaws in space. And that was able to give, talking about Alien wasn't working, but once you made this connection, like if you know Jaws and that feeling of this foreboding creature that's coming to attack you in space, then that switch gets flipped, and I think people can actually start to see something in a whole new way. And sometimes those connections are right in front of you. Of course, what we're talking about is analogy in a lot of cases. X is like Y. And I want to play a little audio here. This is purely audio. This is from the radio show and podcast This American Life. They did a show called Back to School that was talking about innovations in the educational system. And the woman that's speaking is called Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and she's a neuroscientist. And what she studies is the brains of kids who come from really challenging backgrounds. Whether it's extreme poverty, abuse, drug addiction, that sort of thing, and what is happening to their brains that keeps them from being good students, and that sort of thing. So that's a little bit of context about this. So I'll play this, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
If you look on the molecular level, you're walking through the forest, and you see a bear, right? So you can either fight the bear or run from the bear. That's kind of your fight or flight system, right?
Right.
And your body releases a ton of adrenaline, right, which is your short-term stress hormone, and something else called cortisol, which tends to be more of a long-term stress hormone. And this dilates your pupils, gets your heart beating fast, your skin gets cold and clammy. That's because you're shunting blood from anywhere that isn't absolutely necessary to the muscles that you need to be able to run from that bear. The other thing that it does, now you can imagine that if you're about to fight a bear, you need some gumption to fight that bear, right? So it kind of shuts off the thinking portion of your brain, right? That executive function, cognitive part. And it turns on the real primal aggression and the things that you need to be able to think that you're going to go into a fight with a bear and come out on the winning side, right?
Yeah.
And that's really good if you're in a forest and there's a bear. The problem is when, that bear comes home from the bar every night, right? And for a lot of these kids, what happens is that this system, this fight or flight response, which is an emergency response in your body, it's activated over and over and over again. And so that's what we were seeing in the kids that I was caring for.
So again, kind of a little bit of a somber story, but I think it's just an amazing example of her being able to relate this really complex neurological thing in the form of an analogy. Because I don't know about you, it gives me goosebumps every time I hear it, because I can actually feel my body sort of going through the things she's talking about a little bit. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Audio? I know it's a little bit deep, kind of a thing. So that's the third stepping stone, is connection, right? Thinking about connecting ideas so that people can understand them better. So ask yourself, when you're explaining something, can I connect this idea to something that my audience is likely to already understand? So now we're going to move more to the Z side of the scale. And by using the scale in this way, I don't mean to say that it goes in this order. You don't do explanations always in the same, context, story, connection, description. But this particular thing is for people who are sort of on the Z side of the scale, who already care about something, but just need to relate some instructions or a description about it. And the way I like to talk about this is in the form of a recipe, right? If you're using a recipe, then you have already decided you're going to make something. You care about making bread or whatever it is. You just want to know how to do it right. And recipes are awesome like that. They give you exactly what to do. And that's enough in most cases. But I think using recipe as a starting point is an interesting way to think about this, because if you look at a recipe and there's something like baking powder and it says to use a tablespoon of baking powder, that's great. But in terms of explanation, sometimes you can take just a little extra step and add a little bit of extra information that I think actually makes the recipe a little bit different. And that question, again, is why? So if you use the idea of a recipe just as an example and think about how often you're explaining something in the form of sort of a recipe, do these steps, if you think about why, then something like baking powder isn't just an ingredient. If you understand why baking powder is there, like what it actually does, how it impacts the bread, then if you understand that question of why, then suddenly that recipe becomes a starting point for experimentation. You can make bread that's more or less, or browner or whiter, or whatever it is you want to do, because you understand why. And oftentimes, things happen so quickly, we're so busy, we don't go there. We just stick to the recipe. But I really want to encourage you to think about taking that extra step of just thinking about not just put baking powder in, but put baking powder in because it does this thing that really matters in the bread, and you can change that, you can manage that. So the idea of description is to ask yourself, how can I describe or instruct someone how to do something, but also help them see why. Like, why do we do it in this order? Or why does this step matter? This doesn't make any sense. That question of why, I think, helps them build not just how to do it, but to understand why it's happening, why you do it the way you do it. So where we've been up to now, we talked about these forces that push against us, like worrying about condescension and defensibility, the pillars of communication, like thinking about your audience and your language. We talked about this path that involves building context and telling stories, making connections, and using descriptions. So let's talk about an example, a real-world example of an explainer video that we made a while back. I'm sure that a lot of you guys are Dropbox users. So in about 2009, Dropbox came to us with a problem that for people who use Dropbox, it's very simple. Once it's installed, it just works. You don't really have to understand that much about it. But the idea of Dropbox, like how you could see it fitting in your life, is a hard thing to explain, especially on the front page of a website. So they really wanted to have something on the front page of their website that would help people understand how Dropbox fits in. So I'll go through the video that we made for them a little bit. This video was on the front page of Dropbox.com for about 3 years, and it was viewed about 30 million times. So it's one of the more definitely the most viewed video we've ever done, but one of the more viewed explainer videos. So we'll start with this idea of agreement and context.
You know how it feels to forget something, like a wallet, phone, or keys. It's like part of your life is missing, along with the things you need. In the real world, you have to plan ahead to prevent problems.
So this idea, everybody knows the feeling. Forgetting wallet and keys. In the real world, you can't do anything about it. All you can do is plan ahead. So we're kind of setting up the technology part.
But these days, the important stuff you keep on computers and phones can be there for you, wherever you are. Files saved on one computer can now be available on all your computers and phones automatically. This is the big idea behind Dropbox.
So now we've connected this real-world feeling of not having your stuff to technology. Because before Dropbox, a lot of us probably felt that feeling of like, oh, that file's on my other computer, or I'm having to email things between computers. So we've kind of brought this real-world feeling that people feel into technology and positioned Dropbox as the way that, as a solution to that. And then we go into a little bit of story.
Let's meet Josh, who is preparing for a big trip to Africa. Right now, all of his trip info is spread across his laptop, desktop, and phone. He wants to bring it all with him and is tired of having to email files to himself. Then a friend told him about Dropbox, which creates a new kind of folder on his computers.
So now that we've brought in Josh, we have someone that we can empathize with, we can imagine being in Josh's position, and the rest of the video is then following Josh through successfully going through the features of Dropbox in a way that hopefully allows people to see themselves doing the same thing. So this is, again, in sort of Common Craft style, and one of the videos that we're probably most recognized for these days. So for you, leaving here today, I hope that you'll think about some things. One is to think about explanation problems around you all the time. I think that there's probably things, maybe it's the product or service or mission that you work on that people just aren't understanding and thinking like, what can I do to make this more understandable? And maybe there's a way to think about explanation as a tool to do that, or a skill that actually can be put to use to do that. Remember that remember the curse of knowledge, right? The book Made to Stick, I think, is a good recommendation. That's not just the curse of knowledge in there. But remember that, we all kind of work in a bubble, and our ideas sometimes have to live outside that bubble, and that means that we have to prepare our ideas and transform them into something that works outside of the language that sounds so familiar to us. And that the goal is to increase understanding, right? It's not technical accuracy. It's not showing how smart you are. It's not covering your ass. It's understanding. And that's something that you do empathetically to help people. It's not about you. It's like Crystal's point earlier. It's not about you. And we do that in part by answering the question, why? Why should I care? I think the best explanations answer that question. Why should I care about this? Why does this matter? Why does this make sense? I also want you to think about a way to get started, and that means, for me, writing it down. I think studies have shown, and writers know this too, that the simple act of writing something down makes it mean something different to you and helps you see it in a different perspective. So if you see an explanation problem at work or at home, pretend you're writing a script. Pretend that, or maybe it's about your job or your profession. People ask all the time, what do you do? That's an opportunity to explain what you do. And instead of sort of struggling every time, take a minute, write it down, and go through it a few times, read it aloud and see how it sounds. You don't have to read it to anybody, but just the act of writing it out will help you see it differently and help you think about how to make it more understandable. Same thing is true for your product or anything that you care about. Explanations work universally. There's no bad place for an explanation. Remember that improvement is possible, that you don't have to worry about condescension if you think about people being smart and not try to dumb things down too much. And then, the worry about defensibility that we discussed earlier is something that we can counteract with focusing on understanding instead of data and details that sort of that focus on technical accuracy. Remember your audience, empathize with them, think about what it is from their perspective, use language that's familiar, and then think about the stepping stones. Think about how you can tell stories and make connections and help people see why they should care about it. And I think if you do these things, then you might see an opportunity to actually play a new role in your organization. If you can be an explainer, that's something that every team needs, that every company needs. I even think that companies can find a competitive advantage in how they can out-explain what they do. In a lot of ways, this is marketing, but understanding is different than selling. And I think that sometimes it takes understanding first, and that's what leads to other things. And if your company is struggling with that, I think that that's something that you can be an advocate for, is this needs a better explanation. We can do this better. So I think that's something that hopefully that you'll take from this as well. So that's what I have. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm happy to have some questions too.